Little sign of peace in Ukraine, but transatlantic diplomatic efforts to end the war are intensifying. Ukraine and its European allies are vying with Russia to sway US President Donald Trump in forging a deal. Can one be reached, or will the war go on? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. Europe's worst conflict since World War II is grinding on, but it's looking like it could be settled at a table prepared by the Trump administration rather than on the battlefields in Ukraine. US President Donald Trump has become the key figure in the conflict. That's reflected in intense efforts by Ukraine and European allies to lobby him. They await new proposals after a peace plan he announced last week set off alarm bells in Brussels and Kyiv as favouring Russia. Moscow believes it's winning on the battlefield, but the cost of the war and sanctions are big incentives for it to reach a deal. With an unpredictable ringmaster like Trump, forecasting what might unfold next is a risky business. With our guest today, we'll try and analyse the thinking in Ukraine, Russia, Europe and the US and see if there can at last be a breakthrough. But first, this report by Katia Lopez-Hodillo.
Ukraine's president is under pressure. After nearly 4 years of war, Vladimir Zelenskyy faces difficult choices. Accept a deal to end the fighting with Russia, with painful consequences, or reject the plan, supported by US President Donald Trump, and face the consequences that might follow. Once a key ally, the US is now the key player in determining what happens next.
How are you, Mr. President?
In the coming days, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner will head to Moscow to meet Russia's President Vladimir Putin to finalize a deal.
We started with Russia. We're having some talks with Russia. Ukraine is doing well. I think they're pretty happy about it. They'd like to see it end. And we won't know for a little while, but we're making progress.
Domestically, Zelensky's administration is also under pressure. The public is angry over corruption scandals, losses on the battlefield, and heavy-handed recruitment into the military. And now the president also has to persuade the nation to accept a peace deal that's expected to include ceding territory to Russia.
Thank you.
Ukraine and its European allies were stunned last week when Trump issued a peace plan they said strongly favored Russia. European leaders scrambled to meet senior U.S. officials in Geneva to present their own version devised with Ukraine. Major sticking points remained, however, including whether NATO could admit Ukraine, the land it may be asked to surrender, and guarantees on its future security and that of Europe.
Any agreement should deliver a just and lasting peace. And it should ensure real security for Ukraine and Europe.
With peace talks underway, Ukraine and Russia continue to launch attacks, with both sides suffering heavy losses, military and civilian. In Ukraine's capital, many say they're tired of war.
Ukraine sees it and the whole world sees it, yet we are killed. Nothing is changing. Things are not getting better at all.
The next few days could prove a critical political test of whether diplomacy can translate into a permanent ceasefire, or fail, allowing the fighting to continue. Katia Lopez-Hodillo, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Now let's bring in our guest. Chris Weafer is Chief Executive Officer at Macro Advisory, a strategic consultancy focused on Russia and the Eurasia region. He joins us from Moscow. Anatol Lieven is the Director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He joins us from Washington, D.C. And Michael Bociurkiw is a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre. He joins us from Cape Town. A warm welcome to each of you. Now, I want to start with Chris first. Chris, there was this 28-point plan. It's now, we think, been whittled down to about 19 points. But we don't really know what's in that plan at the moment. But what we do know, what we can say for sure, is it's not a plan that either Ukraine or the Europeans are particularly happy about because it cedes too much to Russia. Is that your understanding?
Yes, as you say, we don't know what's in the revised plan. We did get sight of the original 28-point plan, which, as you say, was very heavily biased towards the Russia position. It is understood that the President's Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner will bring the revised plan to Moscow. Almost certainly the revised plan will not be accepted by Moscow. The hope is that they will counter with some proposals, and this to and fro will continue until both sides can agree on something acceptable. But to be clear, nobody is going to be fully satisfied with the eventual plan. By definition, that will be the case. But what I think is happening now is there is a much more serious effort at trying to kind of bridge the gap and reach compromises, however unpalatable, but compromises that both sides can live with. That process now seems to be a lot more serious this time than we've seen all year.
Anatol, I'm going to come to you next. I was in Kyiv in January when Donald Trump was inaugurated. We were talking back then about any potential peace plan that he might bring forward. What we were hearing back then is pretty similar to the peace plan he's pushing forward now, which is basically lopping off a huge chunk of Ukraine and giving it to Russia and not accepting Ukraine into NATO and security guarantees that Ukraine won't be happy with but might have to swallow. But this is not going to be palatable for the Europeans in any way. They are going to push back against this. Are they, and have they, presented an alternative plan?
Well, yes, they did put forward an alternative plan worked out with the Ukrainians, which changes some of the key elements of Trump's original proposal. There is no longer Ukrainian withdrawal from the whole of the Donbass. NATO membership is left open. A European reassurance force in Ukraine is left open. Now, none of these will be acceptable to the Russians, though there is, I think, a possibility of a compromise on the territorial issue in the Donbass if it could be handed over to a neutral international administration. But it's not actually the case that a huge amount of land, according to this, the 28-point plan, is being lopped off from Ukraine. It's already been lopped off by the Russians. And unless the West is prepared to go to war to recover it, the Ukrainians can't get it back. So the 28-point plan simply acknowledges reality. It doesn't call for legal recognition of Russian rule, because that you will never get from the Ukrainians. It's just basically recognizes present military reality, which in the end, everyone will have to do.
Michael, I want to talk to you about security guarantees. When there was the fall of the Soviet Union, there were nuclear weapons in Ukraine, which Ukraine then, and I think something like 2,500 I read, which Ukraine then gave back to the Russian Federation in return for security guarantees. That gets talked about a lot in Ukraine, that the security guarantees coming from Russia absolutely not worth the paper they're printed on because there was a full-scale invasion. Now, security guarantees are going to be a big talking point here. What can NATO do? What can the Europeans do? What can the Americans do to actually guarantee security?
Sure. Well, if I can first just challenge a little bit the previous speaker and his somewhat pro-Kremlin analysis. The agreement we first saw actually does seem to hand over quite a bit of territory.
Anatol, we'll get to you in a minute. I'll give you a right to reply. I'll give you a right to reply. Michael, carry on.
Quite a bit of territory to. It does seem to have to hand over quite a bit of territory to the Ukrainians that isn't controlled by the Russians. This is unacceptable. What kind of signal does that give out to other autocrats, non-state actors? And what it does also, it would put the Russians on a very upgraded strategic position where they could advance up to the Dnipro, if not further. In terms of security guarantees, I think we're in a deplorable situation right now where you have the Americans and the Russians on a high-speed train. You have Zelenskyy and his team on the platform trying to catch up. And you have the Europeans fumbling for change, trying to buy a ticket to get onto the platform. You're right. The Budapest Memorandum and what happened in 2014 and 2022 has really traumatized them. And, you know, in this very unpredictable world, we saw at the G20 a lot of talk about this where I was attending, is that no one knows what's going to happen next. Even if, for example, whether it's Ukraine or Gaza, we're talking about security guarantees are offered by the United States. We know that Mr. Trump is very unpredictable. He gets irritated easily. He has no ideology. And, you know, would it be binding on a future administration? I'm not so sure. And I think most Ukrainians feel that way. So the Ukrainians, again, deservedly traumatized by what happened in Budapest. And they have to be extremely careful about what is promised next to them.
Anatol, I'm going to come back to that point that Michael brought up. You know, this is, you say it's a reality, but Michael's suggesting that actually it doesn't have to be. You have a strong feeling about this. What is it?
Well, first of all, the 28-point plan does not say that Russia will occupy this just 1% of Ukrainian territory, but 20% of Donetsk. It doesn't say that Russia will occupy it militarily. It will be demilitarized. And the Ukrainians can build new defensive lines, further back. So this is not, in fact, a great military sacrifice or sacrifice of Ukrainian security. But on the larger question of de facto acceptance of Russian occupation, as I say, this is military reality, unless we are prepared to go to war with Russia to recover this territory, which we're clearly not. That also applies to security guarantees and NATO membership. NATO members, all of them, including the Biden administration, have said explicitly again and again, we will not go to war to defend Ukraine. Well, at that point, there are no absolute security guarantees. I mean, all there are is an ability, which we have shown, to arm the Ukrainians sufficiently and for them to have a sufficiently large army that if Russia invaded again, Russia once again would pay a colossal price, which they have done in this war, which is why they are now prepared to make a peace somewhat advantageous to them. But let's forget, this 28 plan is far, far short of what Putin was aiming at the start of this war. He wanted to subjugate the whole of Ukraine.
Anatol, you make some really good points, and you make some really good points. I want to bring in Chris here. Chris, this idea that you can have enough Ukrainian troops to fend off a second or third invasion coming from Russia, you're just militarizing. If you follow that route, you're just asking for an incident to spark on that border, which will lead to full-scale war. There has to be a better way of doing this, surely.
Yeah, and this obviously is a key part of the discussion. And it is worth noting, and it is interesting to note that the US team, a very prominent member of the US negotiation team now, and for the first time, includes a senior military figure, the Secretary of the US Army, Driscoll. He's now very central to the negotiating team. And the assumption is that he's there to instill some reality, if you like, into the conversation, to point out what the realities in terms of military are, and will be on the ground. So, yeah, I think this whole question of security guarantees, of what sort of a neutral zone or demarcation zone or whatever you call it, this is now a very central part of the conversation. It's not just abstract politics, but there is an effort to try and put some reality into the conversation as to what can be done, what can be dangerous, what can lead to peace, or what, as you say, may spark a future confrontation. This is now a very core part of the conversation.
And also a core part of this, Michael, is, the role of NATO. We've touched upon it, but let's unpack this a little bit further. NATO has a very simple philosophy. An attack on one is an attack on us all. So if Ukraine does join NATO, which is seemingly off the table at the moment. But is there a way of Ukraine becoming a part of NATO, a major non-NATO ally, perhaps, or NATO light? Is there a way forward that they can negotiate for their security guarantees, do you think?
Sure. Well, I think in Ukraine, and I've spent a lot of time there since before the start of the war, I think a lot of Ukrainians actually would be willing to forego NATO membership because they're very close to NATO and to Europe, and they see what's happening. A lot of Ukrainians and probably other Europeans wonder, what is the threshold that needs to be reached for this collective response? I mean, we saw, for example, the Russians with their spy ship, the antics they're doing there off UK coastal waters, shining military-grade laser weapons into the eyes of RAF pilots. We've seen these mysterious drones appear on at European airports, a whole bunch of other things. And, I think this is also Mr. Putin deliberately probing for weak spots, and he's found plenty. And you're hearing more and more Mr. Zelenskyy and his team float the idea of a more kind of micro Eastern European security architecture. And I think that's the way to go. Let's face it as well. I mean, NATO was basically, the United States was basically the guarantor of NATO security. I think they're willing to pass that on to the Europeans. But there's growing doubts about its ability to really respond. There's still, I'm pretty sure about this, still in the back of the minds of many leaders, whether it's Starmer or Macron, that we're afraid of Mr. Putin. He has nuclear weapons. We don't want to provoke him too much.
Anatol, let's just delve further into this idea of effectiveness of NATO. Michael's just brought up some points there that are valid. The Russians have been pushing. They have been pushing. NATO hasn't really pushed back. And now, in order to trigger Article 5, which is when the war, NATO joins in because there has been an attack on one of its members. The threshold for that is really high. But is there a diplomatic version of NATO that Ukraine could rely on? Because it doesn't seem to be the Security Council at the UN. There doesn't seem to be a mechanism that Ukraine can go to if it gets to the point where Russia is pressing after a peace deal has been made. What's the diplomatic options there?
Well, it has been suggested that sanctions can be suspended with a snapback clause. In other words, the plan talks about Russia's reintegration into the world economy, but with a legally assured point that Russia will be excluded again and heavily sanctioned if it resumes aggression. There can be certain limits, long-range missiles, for example, provided to Ukraine, and these limits will be lifted. You can have designated stockpiles of weapons, which once again will be provided to Ukraine if Russia attacks again. But on the diplomatic front, remember that key Russian partners in the world, like India, even China perhaps, did not want this war. If you get a treaty that is ratified by the United Nations and by the UN Security Council, this would be, I believe, a very strong diplomatic deterrent to Russia against resuming the war, because Russia has devoted so much effort to wooing what it calls the global majority, what we call the global South, that I don't think that it would want to alienate these countries, especially, of course, if you have a demilitarized zone occupied by UN peacekeepers drawn from these countries. The last thing that Russia would want to do is kill Indian peacekeepers.
I want to come to Chris now. Chris, we touched upon sanctions there. Let's talk about money. There is a huge incentive for Russia, and that's rejoining the G8, because they have been barred from that. It's now the G7. So there are sanctions on them that are crippling. They could be lifted into, if they get this like $100 billion to build Ukraine, if Russia pays that, then the sanctions can be lifted. That must be a real driver. Just unpack that for us.
Sure. Actually, just very quickly, can I just agree with Anatoly there that we should not underestimate the influence now being used by India, China in particular, perhaps other countries in the BRICS group, there is definitely very compelling evidence to say that at least Beijing and New Delhi are encouraging Russia to move towards a peace plan to end this war, because of course they are being impacted in terms of tariffs and threats, etc., from the US, and they don't want that. So there is at least encouragement. I won't say too much pressure, but there's encouragement from those countries towards Moscow to bring an end to it. But yeah, in terms of sanctions, you're right, and this is kind of one of the factors now we're now at. The fact that President Trump has applied sanctions to Russia for the first time in this administration does make a difference. On October 22nd, the US applied sanctions to Rosneft and Lukoil. Now, in themselves, it's not that crippling because there are workarounds and there are ways around it. But the fact that he had sort of crossed the line in terms of sanctions, and of course is now talking about, as part of his style, of course, is always a mixture of incentives and threats, but he's talking about applying more and more damaging sanctions to Russia and greater enforcement of existing sanctions. That is a message that is being heeded in Moscow. The economy is stable. The budget is fundable. Growth is low, but it's manageable. There is no particular crisis in the economy. But of course, much more severe sanctions from the US, like another round has been talked about, proposed by Congress, that would possibly tip the economy into a crisis situation. So there's no doubt in my mind that while Russia will play hardball on these negotiations, probably for some time, for some months, I think we are now talking only about months, because they cannot afford another round of very damaging US sanctions. That would tip the economy over. And I think that's now a serious consideration.
Anatol, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but I want to go to Michael. Michael, there is another time consideration here. The midterms are coming up in the US. They may well lose the House. There is an opportunity here that Vladimir Putin is very aware of, that he will get a good deal from Donald Trump. So now is the time to strike. Do you think that is part of Vladimir Putin's thinking?
I'm not so sure, because, we've seen Congress sidelined so much by this Trump administration. They're basically a staffing arm of the White House. Of course, we have seen in the past 2 or 3 days, Republican senators really trashed a plan that was leaked, saying it's not worth the paper it's printed on, it should be shredded. But I think Mr. Trump, what is the real driver here for him is to get that Nobel Peace Prize. And if we are to believe the leaked call between Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Putin's envoy, that showed that, Witkoff was basically coaching their Russian counterpart on how to butter up Mr. Trump. It seems that's the way things are headed. If I can just briefly also on the G7, G8, I spoke to a senior South African minister here at the G20, and I put it to him very directly, should Russia come back in and make it the G8? And he said, yes, it's better to have them in the room. However, having said that, I'm not so sure anymore the Russians are that keen to be part of these structures. I think, like China, they're prepared to go much, much more their own and very, very quickly. I'm not so sure either if China is interested in Russia, winning this war. It actually benefits Beijing for a weak Russia, because I spent a lot of time in Asia and they have their eyes very, very much on the Russian Far East.
Anatol, it's the same question to you. Is this the time that Vladimir Putin thinks, I've got Donald Trump on my side, the midterms haven't happened yet, this is my time to get as much as I can? Do you agree with that?
Not entirely, because on the other hand, the Russian generals apparently are telling him that if the war goes on, there is a good chance that the Ukrainians will collapse, given their recruitment problems, given their internal political problems. So I think Putin is balanced between, different advice and different incentives. On the one hand, the economic ones that Chris has talked about, the fear of much greater economic damage. Yes, the personal relationship with Trump and his desire for an early peace. But on the other hand, the hope that if the war goes on, Russia will, a few months down the line or a few years, gain very much more. And I think on that point, it is also worth saying that it cannot be said reasonably that Ukraine will be in a better position militarily in future than it is now. There is no evidence to suggest that that will be the case.
Now, Chris, this idea that Russia can rejoin the G8 being a big driver of what Vladimir Putin is doing, it's a big incentive for him. Michael slightly disagrees with all of that. But what's your take? Do you think there could be an alternative G8 for Russia with the BRICS countries, or do you think G8 is the driver?
No, I agree, Michael. I don't think the G8 is that much of an incentive for Russia. First of all, of course, we have heard from the EU's foreign secretary Kallas and from German Chancellor Merz that there is no way that President Putin would be allowed back into the G8. So if Russia comes back into a G8, it would be with a different president. You cannot imagine any circumstance where President Putin turns up at G7 and is welcomed. But I don't think the Russians are that interested. They're much more focused on BRICS. They're much more focused on building up the BRICS plus platform and having that as kind of like as a counter to the G7, because the narrative from Moscow over the last 3 years is that the G7 is kind of a Western economic club that it primarily promotes the interests, whether they're economic, political, even climatic interests of Western nations, and that the rest of the world, global South as we call it, should have their own representation, and that's BRICS. So I really don't think that the G8, return to G8, is any sort of incentive. But returning to the global economy, though, that's different. President Putin has on many, many occasions over the last 20 years talked about the need for a country to have a very strong economy, to be a big part of the global economy, not just militarily, in order to be a great power. So the economy does matter. And getting the economy back on track and integrating it back into the global economy, it is a factor. And therefore, as I repeated earlier, I think the desire to avoid future sanctions, to get the economy sort of back onto some sort of a recovery track, I think that is now kind of a big factor for the Kremlin. Can I just add one last point, just it's worth mentioning in terms of timing and deadlines. When we get to the end of January, this conflict will have lasted longer than Russia's involvement in World War II. It will have lasted longer than the Great Patriotic War. And that's actually getting some traction, some notice and some discussion in Moscow. People are asking, well, what's it all about? Why? You can see what the benefits of why there was the Great Patriotic War. But the fact that we're now coming up against this deadline, it's not inconsequential.
I mean, you're absolutely right about that. 4 years ago, I was in Kyiv when the full-scale invasion happened, and I didn't think I would be talking about it 4 years later. I want to thank all our guests, Chris Weafer, Anatol, Lieven, and Michael Bociurkiw. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.